This past week, I was down in Eminence, Missouri, at a place called Discovery Ministries. We take our junior hires down there for an adventure retreat camp. That trip is always a little bit challenging. That is by design. We took them deep into a cave. We took them up a rock wall. We did a little bit of cliff jumping. Just a lot of things that were either difficult or scary or both, because that's good. It's good for us to be challenged in those ways, get outside of our comfort zone a little bit. So it was a lot of fun, and that's a great place to do that because it's kind of a sacred place. And we've talked about that before. I have with Camp Como in Colorado. I talked about that a lot last year. It just seems to be a special place where a lot of good God things tend to happen. That place is set apart for a purpose, which happens to be the definition of holy. Do you guys have objects in your house maybe that are just for special occasions? My mind automatically goes to fancy china or something like that. We never had anything like that growing up, but a lot of people do. That's set apart, hopefully for a purpose. Sometimes people set that type of stuff so far apart that it never gets used and it kind of loses its purpose. So those weren't exactly holy. They lost their purpose. That doesn't quite fit our definition of holy, which is set apart, different, for a purpose. And in the Old Testament, you had all sorts of things that were set apart. They were different for a purpose. The temple was set apart. But even further than that, the inner court was set apart from the outer. The holy place was separated from the most holy place. There were altars, candles, all sorts of artifacts that served specific purposes in worship. And that was good. They were meaningful. They also had sacred days, feasts, holidays, all sorts of stuff that was set apart from the normal, from the mundane. And they all served a purpose of worship. If something was set apart, it somehow tied into the worship of the holy God. Either a celebration of something he had done, or a celebration of something about his character and who he is. It always tied into worship. And that hasn't really changed today. We still set things apart for a purpose. But the typical line basically more or less goes like this. Everything that is in the church is sacred, and everything outside of the church is secular. And when you come here, we are in a sacred place where we have sacred stuff that helps us do sacred things, just like the temple and the artifacts and the worship of the Old Testament. And when you go outside this place, we have secular stuff where we do secular things, or where we have secular places that have secular stuff and we do secular things. And while the thinking behind that statement isn't exactly wrong, it makes sense, like this is a special place. That dichotomy of sacred and secular doesn't actually really exist in the Bible. Not when God is involved, and certainly not in the New Testament. So I kind of just want to spend this morning challenging our thinking about that just a little bit. And a pretty simple example comes right from the get-go. In Genesis 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And if we pause right there, have you ever considered that the very first thing that we see of God, the very first thing that we can possibly learn about God, the first thing that he wants to teach us about himself, is that he works? It doesn't say that in the beginning God loved. He did, but it doesn't say in the beginning God loved. It doesn't say in the beginning God rested. No, it says in the beginning God worked. He created. And then if you jump down to verse 28, it says, God blessed them, being us, humanity, and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds of the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Did you know that when we work, we are being like God? We are acting out the image of God inside of us. Did you know that God made work before the fall? As in, when the earth was perfect, exactly the way that God intended it, before sin entered the world and ruined everything, there was work. Now, it wasn't supposed to be quite as difficult and laborsome as it is now. The earth wasn't going to work against us or fight us while we were trying to do these things. But God intended us to work, even when it was perfect. Work is supposed to be sacred. That's why Colossians 3:23 says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if you are working for the Lord, not for human masters." That's easy for people, it's easy for me, to look at a job like mine and say that I'm working for God. It was a lot more difficult for me to say that when I was building houses with Mayberry Construction. It just feels different. Most days it was difficult to have kind of a Christ-like attitude or think that I was working for Jesus when I was working in an industry where everybody was just mad all the time. And I had great coworkers, don't get me wrong, they were awesome people, but it's just kind of an industry where nothing ever goes right, ever, and people are grumpy all the time. Just ask Stetson, he's grumpy all the time too. But as Christians, our work is not supposed to be considered secular. Our work is for God, set apart, he's laughing at me, set apart for a purpose. It's sacred. The church fathers developed a term for how the Trinity engaged with the other members, with itself. It's perichoresis. And everybody say that, perichoresis. It means the three-person dance. All right, they described this ebb and flow of submission within the Trinity that as they worked in creation, they were dancing. They were having fun, and we see this dance form in the Genesis account, this dance of work and enjoy, work and enjoy, work and enjoy. As they were creating together, working together, enjoying together, God, all three persons, they were having a party with themselves. And this fun that was present in the cycle of work and joy produced you and produced me. So what does our work produce? Because I know a lot of my work tends to just produce a bad attitude, but does it create a fun ebb and flow of work and enjoyment? Does it show people the love of Christ, or does it just produce enough money for you to live on? Our work is supposed to be set apart for a purpose, and as we know from Scripture, all things that are set apart for the purpose of worship. And that seems weird. It seems weird that our work is supposed to be worship. It doesn't quite feel right. I do think there's a reason. We can keep searching in Exodus 35, starting in verse 31. It says this, "And he filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of artistic crafts. He has filled them with skill to do all kinds of work as engravers, designers, embroiderers in blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen and weavers, all of them skilled workers and designers." And today, we have kind of a divide. We have what you would call Christian art and secular art. Historically, it was just called art. But the divide goes like this. It's Christian art if it mentions or depicts God or Jesus or the church in some way. That's what makes it Christian. It talks about Jesus. And that makes sense. It really does. And artistically depicting our faith is a good thing. It is a very good thing. Songs about Jesus are good. I love worship music. Like specifically, I'm not talking about all Christian music. I'm specifically talking about worship music. I love worship music. Obviously, during our gatherings, we're going to sing to God about God. I'm not picking on that at all. That genre makes sense. But there was a time in history, you look just a few hundred years back, and Christianity was the epicenter of all of the world's best art, of all kinds. Sculptures, poetry, buildings. Today, not so much. We've claimed to be created by the most creative being in the universe, in his own image, and I don't think we're really living up to that reflection super well most of the time, not at least in the way that we should. And part of the reason being maybe because we've boxed ourselves in a little bit too much. Creativity and artistic expression isn't really present in church anymore. All you have to do is look at church services across the country. They have become the most predictable and pragmatic moments of our lives every single week. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's no wonder why hyper-creative types of people are bored out of their minds. We need to reclaim the title of epicenter of the world's best art. I really think that we do, and we need to open up the walls a little bit on what we would consider Christian art to be to do that. Because here's the strange truth. And I know that this is true because of the way that we are made. We can't get outside of this. But all forms of creativity or artistic expression is worship. We cannot create without worshiping. We don't necessarily know what we're worshiping, but we cannot create without worshiping because that is how God made us. So if I built a table, right, that process is an act of worship. I'm using skills that God gave me to do that. That process is an act of worship. Now, I may be worshiping my own skills, which aren't that great, so that would be a bad thing to do. But I may be worshiping my own skills, right? Or I may be worshiping the table itself, which also is a bad idea. Or I may be trying to sell it, so I may be worshiping the money that it can make me. Or during the process of making the table, I can be recognizing that I am acting out skills that God gave me, and the process of making that table can be my act of worship. I could be in that frame of mind, worshiping Him through the process. Now, the table can have Jesus carved into it or not. That doesn't make a difference. And whether or not something is worship is not determined by the product itself. It's determined by the process. Right, so our attitude of the heart during the process. So that may be obvious with a table, but it applies to anything, even music or anything else. I know a lot of Christian songwriters that don't exclusively write songs about Jesus. That doesn't make it less Christian. Right, sometimes they write songs about love or about friends or just about stupid things just for fun, because it's okay to have fun too. The lead animator of the cartoon that came out just a couple years ago, Ferdinand, with the bowl, the lead animator on that project was a Christian. Now, we still probably would never consider that Christian art, but we have a word for it. We have a word for it in the church when worship becomes more about the product than the process. Idolatry. And where this hits home for me the most is how picky I can get with worship music. Because I'm not suggesting that we stop singing to God about God on Sunday. That's a specific genre and it makes sense. But I've become so much more interested in the product than the process. As in, I like these songs. I have my favorite worship songs. I don't like these songs. I have my 3 reasons that I think this song is a dumb song and we shouldn't be singing this song. Right? It's not wrong to have favorite songs and less favorite songs, but when your worship becomes hindered by song choice, then you, like me, have fallen into the trap of worshiping songs rather than God. I'm running in circles a little bit, I realize, but God has created us all with skills, some more creative, some more practical. It doesn't matter. When we use them, however we use them, we get to determine whether it is sacred or whether it is secular. We can decide if we set these things apart for the purpose of worship or not. And I think it's starting to come in a little more clearly how God intended this holy or sacred thing to work. Just in John chapter 4, starting in verse 20, it says, our fathers, this is the woman at the well, and the woman at the well is speaking to Jesus. She says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. And then Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be His worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. I know that's a little bit wordy. All it means is that the worship of God is not limited to any single place. Like this church, we know that that's not really new. Any place can be intentionally set apart for the worship of God. Even any moment can be set apart for the intentional worship of God. This is what I talked at length about last year when I got back from camp. But let me just tell you a little bit about our experiences from camp that we had this last week, not because I feel like I need to drive this point home, but just because I can and you're sitting there listening to me. And they were cool. So it rained on us the whole time we were there, which was a bummer. So we weren't able to do the high ropes course that I really wanted to do called Mount Zippy's Revenge. That one's nice and scary, and I wanted to terrify them a little bit, but we didn't get a chance to do that. So we did a rock wall instead, which is also outside, but we were able to put some tarps over it, so it was like mostly dry. And some of the students were really pretty intimidated by this wall. It was pretty tall, and they were rightly intimidated by it. It was tall enough that a fall in the right way could have been fatal, or at least left pretty lasting damage. And I distinctly remember Bethany Hildebrand. There were 4 different routes that you could go on of varying difficulties, and on these 4, they had different challenge routes you could take if you wanted to, where they had tape on certain things, like you could only touch the ones with tape on it if you wanted to try it that way, just to keep it fun, because we were on that wall for like 3 hours. But I distinctly remember Bethany Hildebrand, right from the beginning, saying, I have her permission to share this story, by the way. I don't want you to think I'm just embarrassing her for no reason. I distinctly remember her saying, like, I just want to go about halfway up. On this one particular wall, where about halfway the wall angled backwards, and you have to climb back like this to get the rest of the way to the top. She's like, I just want to go about halfway up, maybe about 10 feet or so, a little higher, and I'll be good with that. Like, that's enough. So we're like, yeah, fine, whatever. And she did. She got on the wall with not all that much difficulty. She made it up to that point, and then she came back down, and she did that about 3 or 4 times, which was great. And then she got down about the 4th time and was like, yeah, I'm done. That was fun. And she just walked away. We're like, okay, whatever. But that whole morning, this was in the afternoon, that whole morning we had been doing little group challenges, talking about how it's really important to do hard things. So about 5 minutes later, out of nowhere, with no encouragement from everybody, she just popped back up and she's like, all right, I'm going to do it. Okay. So we strapped her back up, and she did. She climbed all the way to the very top of the wall. She got the whole way up there. Now, coming down is actually the scarier part, because the safest way to come back down off of the wall is to just let go and dangle in midair for a little while. So you have to let go. You have to put all of your trust in the rope, all of your trust in your belayer that's holding you up there and whatnot. So that took a second. But the moment she let go and swung back in midair, she immediately started laughing. Right? She went from terrified, clinging on for dear life, to having the time of her life in 1 second just by letting go. And when she got back down and we were done, you better believe we talked about what it means to let go. And then we talked about carabiners, and we talked about that's the little circle thing that's actually holding you onto the wall. We talked about what it looks like to put all of your faith and trust in Jesus. Right, and then later on, we went to cliff jumping. We went cliff jumping, and we had kind of a similar experience. One of the girls from Seneca, because we combined with Seneca for this trip, one of the girls from Seneca was really scared to jump off the cliff. We got up there, and she stood there looking over the edge for what felt like a couple of hours. And then she didn't jump. She just walked back down because we had to leave. So it was a real bummer. But we went back the second day. And she got right back up there. Even though she didn't jump the first day, she went right back up. Even though she was scared, she got right back up on the edge, and she still didn't jump, because not every story has a happy ending. But we did still learn. We did still learn stuff from that experience, and we were jumping off a cliff, for goodness sake. Like, we were worshiping jumping off of a cliff, but the coolest one was the cave. We took them deep into a wild cave, which means it has not been, taken care of in any way. There aren't steps. There isn't electricity. It's a wild cave. It was actually only discovered a few years ago. It's on private property. Discovery Ministries only goes there because they have special permission from the landowners. We aren't allowed to take pictures of the outside of it because they're trying to keep it a secret, its location, because they don't want people coming and defacing it or whatever. So we got a ways inside, and we saw all of these amazing formations. If you've been in a cave, you know what I'm talking about. Most of humanity never gets to see these things, but it's beautiful. And then we got way in there. We got all the way into the back of this cave. It took about an hour to get as deep in as we were. And then we turned off all of our lights. And if you have never experienced absolute darkness like that, you're really missing out. Right? Standing outside in the middle of the night, even if it's cloudy, it doesn't come anywhere close to the dark that you get to experience in a cave. And then we talked about how Jesus is the light of the world. How there's no possible way we could get out of here without light. We would be lost in there forever, and nobody knows where we are to come rescue us. That's not actually true. It's not. The camp people would know to come looking for us if we didn't come back in an hour. But our leader then pulled out a glow-in-the-dark ball and shined a light on it to charge it up. And then we passed it around, and we talked about how if Jesus were to pour his light into us, then we can be a light to other people. And we get to shine the light of God to everybody else. And we got back that night, and that experience led us down a huge rabbit trail of discussion. Like the question came up, why did God even make this cave? And there's been however many billions of people that have lived throughout history, and maybe 500 people have ever seen that place. So why spend the time, why waste the time, as most of us would say, making that cave? I think, personally, because he loves it, because he can't help himself, because that's who he is. God just creates beautiful things. He's a creative God. He just loves doing it, whether or not we're even going to see it. And then we talked about how he created each of us in his own image, how each of us have unique gifts and things that help us see God more clearly. Like the more I get to know Kenna or Jake or Oni or Dalton, the more I can learn about God's character that I wouldn't have maybe understood as well before. So then we went around the circle and we started talking about how each of us have unique gifts and how each of those different things teach us something about God's character. Because Romans 1:20 says that God's divine nature, his infinite power have been seen clearly in his creation. That's the world, the mountains, the caves. That's also the people. So that was a super fun experience, going around and learning new things about God's character just from observing each other. And on our way back, the youth minister from Seneca just made a small comment in the van that stuck with me. He said, "This week was awesome. We had good Bible study. We had great discussion. The only thing I felt like it was missing was worship." And I just quietly thought to myself, man, if you don't think we've been worshiping for the entirety of the last 4 days, you have got to broaden your definition of what it means to worship. Because here's what I'm driving at this morning. In the Old Testament, God set aside artifacts and places and days for the purpose of worship. But now, after Christ, God has set apart people. Which is why we're able to do the same thing. Romans 12:1 says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." Our work, our fun, our creativity, our church services, our whole lives are meant to be a living sacrifice for God. There is no divide between sacred and secular when God's people are involved. Right, God is for everything, in everything, and through everything, according to Ephesians 4:6. So here is the question that really gets to the crux of the issue. If you remember nothing else today, remember to go home and ask yourself this question. Is Jesus really the Lord of your life? That seems like the wrong question to ask, but it's not. Now, I know everyone, pretty much everyone in here is going to have that immediate knee-jerk reaction of, yeah, of course Jesus is the Lord of my life. That's why I'm here. But I think we probably need to slow down and think about that just a little bit more. I think we probably have at least a slight misunderstanding of it. And one thing that illustrates that to me is how often Janie and I get asked this question. If you're from Colorado, if your family is in Colorado, if you think Janie's family is going to be back in Colorado soon, within the next few years, if you love the mountains, like the weather in Colorado better, if you hate the humidity here, why are you here? Now, I know you're really using that as a conversation piece, so I'm not actually getting on to like the 2/3 of you in here who have asked me that. But that question has forced me to iron out something in my own mind, and that is most of us as Americans, we make all of our decisions based on what either makes the most sense, what's going to make us the most comfortable, or what's going to make us the most happy. 3 things that God doesn't seem to care about all that much. Not that God wants you to be miserable, but he cares more about your holiness than your happiness because he knows that that is the path to true joy. If God called you out of this place, would you go? Or if God called you to a job that made less money, would you go? Not that God calls every single person to a specific place at a specific time. He does sometimes, but not always. But if we alone, if I alone, if you alone, if we alone are the only ones making decisions, making every decision for our lives, something is missing. We don't fully comprehend what it means to make Jesus the Lord of our lives. We don't fully comprehend what it means to offer up our whole lives as a living sacrifice. Is every single thing you do focused on the mission of bringing more people to know God, or isn't it? Do you accept jobs or move into homes or cities or buy cars or whatever based on how God wants to use you? Based on how that can help you accomplish the mission? Or do you make these decisions based on what makes sense, what is comfortable, or what is going to make you happy? 5 years ago, almost to the day, it started in July 5 years ago, a fire started just west of Colorado Springs called the Waldo Canyon Fire. Some of these pictures I took, some of them I just ripped them offline, but most forest fires end up doing a lot of damage, and they're super expensive. But this one hit such a populated area, it's one of the most expensive fires ever recorded in North America. It burned for about a month before they could finally put it out. This one right here, for those of you that went to Colorado with us, we were at this intersection a couple of different times. That's right on the way to Garden of the Gods. The day it started, I was in Denver with my mom. We were shopping because that's the only thing my mom does. And about 60 miles away from Colorado Springs, the day it started, I got this picture. And you can see just within hours how much smoke is rising up into the sky, even from so far away. This is a better picture. Again, this is the day the fire started, just a few hours after the fire started. This is west looking east towards Colorado Springs, some 80, maybe 100 miles away. In the Old Testament, one of the daily rituals was the offering of incense. And this was said to be the most pleasing of all sacrifices to God because it was a sweet smell to him that would rise up to heaven. And every day, twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, the priest would go out and he would light the incense. And from all around Jerusalem, anywhere in the city, you could see the smoke rising from the altar as a sacrifice to God. Doug Aldridge is one of my professors and the academic dean at OCC. He was a firefighter when he was younger, so he made this analogy that I liked. But what kind of offering is my life to God? When people look at my life, can they see smoke rising from the altar as a sacrifice pleasing to God? Can they see me even maybe from hundreds of miles away? Or am I too busy controlling my own life, not living set apart for His purpose? When I think of people like Isaac and Karen, like Greg shared with us this morning, you know, I barely had a chance to get to know them. They were here for about a year, not even quite a full year, with me before they left. And I asked Karen one day what made her decide Cambodia, and she told me that for years, she had felt God tugging at her heart like she needed to do something. Maybe she needed to go onto the mission field, and she had been trying for years to just ignore it until she finally decided to let go of what made sense, the comfort, the happiness that they were experiencing here. And when I look at Isaac and Karen's life and what Greg just described to us that they're doing, I see smoke rising from the altar as a sacrifice that's pleasing to God. Now, when I think of people like my wife's uncle, Jay St. Clair, he left a 20-plus year ministry at College Heights with a good salary, a dependable salary, to answer God's call to serve the homeless people of Joplin. So he left all of the comfort. He no longer has a guaranteed salary. They have no idea where their next meals are going to come from unless he raises the funds every single month, which if you know him, that is not something he is good at or likes doing. But when I look at Jay, I see smoke rising from the altar of his life as a sacrifice that's pleasing to God. And then I think of people that I've gotten to know well, like Aaron Skiles, Greg and Amy's kid. He had a plan for college. I don't know who all knows it. He had a plan for college leading up all the way until late June, right before he was going to college. He was going to go to Pitt State, and he had scholarships to where that was going to be a very inexpensive trip to college for him. But at that point, for almost 2 years, he had been feeling a tug. And right before college, I think this stressed his dad out a little bit, but he decided to ditch all the plans and the free money and go to OCC. And now he spent his entire summer, touring around all of the Midwest, sharing the love of Jesus with high school students. And when I think of Aaron, I see smoke rising from the altar of his life as a sacrifice pleasing to God. Is Jesus really the Lord of your life? What if this place became a place full of people who decided to ditch the false dichotomy of sacred and secular and lived our whole lives as an act of worship? Inside the box thinking is that everything inside the church is sacred and everything outside the church is secular. But what if we recognized every moment of our lives as a unique opportunity to show the love of Jesus with no strings attached? So now my work is my ministry. My family is my ministry. My life is my ministry. Fur Road, if we adopted this mentality, Fur Road would be a place where we could see smoke rising from the altar of our worship from miles and miles away. And Carl Junction would probably never be the same. So this afternoon, all of us, I want us all to go home and remember to ask ourselves this one really simple question. Is my life sacred or is it secular? Will you pray with me? God, thank you so much for what you've been doing in this place, what you're doing through people in this place. There's so many stories of people here where we can see smoke rising from the altars of our lives.